Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which in heaven is perfect. We're going to discuss that verse. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. It's the very last verse in the chapter. Most Christians don't like that verse. Is it a commandment? What is it? If you think it's a commandment, how are you making out with it? Are you keeping it? We're going to talk about this. Matthew chapter 5 is divided up into about 4 sections. It starts with the Beatitudes. It then moves into a section where Jesus tells you he's perfect. He then contrasts that with the scribes and Pharisees and the rest of us in general, pointing out that none of us is perfect. No matter how righteous we may appear, none is perfect. He then provides a list of sins. If we read it honestly, we know he's telling the truth. We're all guilty of these sins, in some way, shape, or form. So then why does he end the chapter, be perfect like the Father in heaven is perfect? To make the point, we don't need to read through the Beatitudes. We need to start with the statement Jesus makes about himself. In verse 17, Jesus says, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." What exactly does that mean? What is he saying? He's telling them that he is the fulfillment of the law. They all know nobody's kept the law. He's telling them he is keeping the law. He's telling them he is perfect. That's a big claim. I can imagine what some of them thought when they heard that. Some of them would have been offended. Certainly the scribes and Pharisees would have been offended, knowing full well that of all in Israel, perhaps they were closer to keeping the law than anybody, but falling short. Jesus said, "No, I am that perfection." That's a claim to deity, to being the God. Then in verse 18 he says, "For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." What's he talking about? He's talking about fulfilling every detail of the law. Every detail. Not just the 10 Commandments, not just the Mosaic Law, but every detail, right down to the jots and the tittles, the minutiae. All of it. When Jesus talks about the law here, he's talking about all of it. 10 Commandments, Levitical law, everything. He's the fulfillment of all of it. He's claiming deity. He's claiming perfection. This is really important because your understanding and my understanding of verse 48 is tied to these statements. Now what does he say next? In verse 19 he says, "Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." He's making no distinction between the seemingly lesser important laws and the big ones. If you think the 10 Commandments are the big ones, fine. But Jesus makes no distinction. He said even the little ones are just as important. And if you teach people that only the 10 Commandments are the important ones, he says you're least in the kingdom of heaven. This is a profound statement. He's making a point that he's keeping all of the law, every bit of it. And if you can't do that, you're not perfect. And here's the kicker. In verse 20, he says to everyone listening, "For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Is Jesus saying that the Pharisees, the scribes and Pharisees, had achieved a high level of righteousness? Or is he saying they'd achieved a medium level of righteousness or a low level? What's he saying? Does it even matter? No. Whatever level of righteousness the Pharisees achieved, he's saying isn't good enough. And he's saying to the people, even if you do better than them, it's not good enough, because only perfect keeping of the law will get you into heaven. Only keeping the law, right down to the jots and tittles, will get you into heaven. And everybody listening knew they hadn't done that. Scribes knew it. Pharisees knew it. The average person knew it. Some of them might have thought, oh, I know scribes and Pharisees who are wonderful people, and they are so close to keeping the law, but I know they don't keep it. How can I ever surpass that? Jesus said, doesn't matter, because you can't do it perfectly. He just made the statement that he is the fulfillment of the law. Every little bit of it, he is fulfilling. So then why did Jesus say at the end of the chapter, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect? When here he's telling you only he keeps the law. Nobody else does. We're going to get to that. Now, if there's any doubt in anybody's mind that's listening to the sermon that Jesus is giving, he then lists all these categorical sins. 25, 26 verses, sin after sin after sin. I can imagine sitting there listening to Jesus give this sermon and being convicted at every step, as we should be right now if we read through every one of those verses. And I'm not going to do that. You can do it yourself. Jesus is making the point. If you think for any reason that you're a righteous person or a decent person, just start reading through these sins, and you'll find yourself in there. You'll find a complete absence of perfection in your life. And you'll also find, upon reflection, a complete inability on your part to be perfect. And this goes for every one of us, before salvation and after salvation. So why does Jesus say, be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect? Is that a commandment? And I ask you again, if it's a commandment, how are you making out with it? Are you keeping it? You know you're not. Nobody keeps that. Only Jesus. That statement is a challenge. It's at the end of the chapter so that we are then forced to examine ourselves, to say, I can't do that. And because I can't be perfect, as the Father in heaven is perfect, I cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. What is the solution? What am I to do? That is what Jesus is bringing us to get real, to be honest with ourselves, and to realize only one person ever lived, walked, breathed, demonstrated a perfect life. And that perfect life, Jesus said, is demonstrated by perfectly keeping the law, all of it, right down to the minute details. That's the only acceptable standard that will get you into heaven. And so, when he says to the people listening, be ye perfect, he's saying, if you want to get into heaven by that method, that is the route, absolute perfection. Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Who has accomplished this? Not I, not you, only Jesus Christ. This statement is not a commandment. It is a challenge to examine ourselves personally. The whole chapter is a challenge that we examine ourselves and compare what we find to the person of Christ. Christ is the absolute perfect keeper of the law. That is the only way to heaven, through works. He tells us we can't do it. But if we want to try, we must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And we must exceed it to perfection. This is a challenge. Be ye perfect. Earlier, I asked the question, was the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees at a high level, a low level, a medium level? What exactly was Jesus talking about when he referred to exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. To understand this, we need to turn to Matthew chapter 23. This is where we learn of the righteousness of the Pharisees. That is, what Jesus thought of their righteousness. Let me read you a few things. He says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves." And then in verse 17 of chapter 23, he refers to them as ye fools and blind. In verse 23, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Verse 24, ye blind guides, which strain a gnat and swallow a camel. Verse 25, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. That's verse 27. Verse 28. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Verse 29. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Verse 31. Ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Verse 33. Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell? This is what Jesus thought of the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, the superficiality, their attempt to keep the law, to present a facade of righteousness, of law-keeping. This is what Jesus refers to in Matthew chapter 5. That is the righteousness of the Pharisees. It is the same arrogance and pride of spirit that was found in Lucifer when he said, "I will be like the Most High." Let us return to the subject of this message. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father, which in heaven, is perfect." Again, I ask the question, if this is a commandment, how are you making out with it? Are you keeping it? Are you perfect as the Father is in heaven? Jesus is not commanding that ye be perfect. He's telling you that if you want to be perfect, there are two ways. One is through Him. The other way is through perfect keeping of the law. That is, the scribes and Pharisees sought that perfection through their own efforts. It is impossible. You cannot be perfect as the Father in heaven is perfect. That was one of Lucifer's big errors. He said, "I will be like the Most High." If you go the route of the Pharisees, you will think that you can be like the Most High. Jesus' whole point is to challenge us, to ask us to consider whether or not we can be perfect and how. And he doesn't give the answer here, but in time he does. He's preparing the people's minds and hearts to accept the truth that perfection is only attainable through him, an imputed righteousness. So when he says, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which in heaven is perfect," he's asking a good thing of us. Yes, it is good to be perfect like the Father, but we can't. Only God is perfect. There is none good save God. "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which in heaven is perfect," is a commandment for those who would seek perfection through the law. That is not for Christians. Our perfection is through Christ. We humbly submit, knowing we can't keep the law. The Pharisees refused to accept that, and they became self-righteous, and they said, just like Lucifer, "We will be perfect like the Most High." Are you getting the point? There's two ways to heaven. One is through the perfect righteousness of keeping the law. The other is through the perfect righteousness of Christ, who keeps the law. Perfection is the key. The question is, which road to perfection are you on? Are you on the road to perfection, believing that you can be perfect as the Father in heaven? Then I'm sorry to say, but you're on the road of the Pharisees. Or are you on the road to perfection because you've submitted to Christ? That's what the verse is about. Thanks for listening.